It studies their campaigns. It catalogs their victories. It carves their names into textbooks. But power does not only reveal itself in how it conquers cities. It reveals itself in what it does to those who cannot fight back. In the Assyrian Empire, mercy was not weakness. It was inefficiency. And for captured women queens, princesses, daughters of defeated rulers, death was often considered too simple, too quick, too clean. What they faced was not chaos. It was policy, calculated, structured, bureaucratic, and it tells us something deeply unsettling about how power thinks when it wants to be remembered. The Assyrian Empire ruled much of Mesopotamia between 911 and 609 BC. Kings like Ashurbanipal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, and Ashurbanipal left behind detailed royal inscriptions. They were public records monuments meant to be read. The goal was clear: domination through spectacle. Most people are familiar with the brutality directed at soldiers' impalement, flaying, mass executions. Those acts were meant for enemy armies. They were warnings to cities that resisted. But the treatment of captured royal women followed a different logic. It was not always about killing. It was about transforming. To understand why, we need to understand how ancient Near Eastern societies viewed identity. In Mesopotamian culture, a name was not just a label, it was existence. To erase a name from inscriptions was to remove someone from history and, symbolically, from the cosmic order upheld by the gods. When Assyrian forces conquered rebellious territories, Elam, Babylon, parts of Syria, and Anatolia, royal women were often taken as part of the spoils of war. Some were absorbed into the royal court. Some were married into political arrangements. Some were relocated. And some were deliberately stripped of status in ways designed to break not only the individual, but the idea of resistance itself. The first step was often administrative. Records altered, titles removed, genealogies erased. A queen became tribute. A princess became property of the palace. A noble daughter became a number in a ledger. It sounds bureaucratic, but bureaucracy normalizes, and normalization makes cruelty sustainable. Assyrian royal inscriptions, studied by scholars like Kirk Grayson and Simo Parpola, reveal a culture deeply invested in projecting fear as policy. The empire did not want its enemies to believe resistance would lead to martyrdom. Martyrs inspire rebellion. Broken symbols inspire obedience. So instead of immediate execution, some high-status women were displayed. Not hidden, displayed. Palace reliefs from Nineveh and Nimrud, many now housed in the British Museum, depict long lines of captives being relocated. Among them are women of noble dress, stripped of their regalia, walking under guard. To the modern eye, they are carvings. To ancient viewers, they were proof. Proof that defiance ended not in glory, but in humiliation. And humiliation is powerful. Psychologically, humiliation reshapes identity. It attacks the social self. A warrior may endure physical pain. A ruler may accept death. But prolonged public degradation dismantles something deeper than narrative. A person tells about who they are. Assyrian records suggest that in some cases, high-ranking women were assigned to labor far beneath their former status. Textile production, food preparation, temple servitude. But because it needed witnesses who would see a former queen reduced to ordinary tasks. Witnesses who would carry that memory back to distant lands. Assyria had reliefs and public displays. The message was identical. This is what happens when you challenge us. But here is where the story deepens. Because the Assyrians were not acting in blind rage, they were operating from a sophisticated understanding of fear psychology. A dead enemy is distant. A living example is unforgettable. He recorded the event in elaborate inscriptions. He described how he devastated the city exhumed royal tombs, and relocated members of the royal household. This was not only about territorial gain, it was about narrative control. By capturing royal women and integrating them into Assyrian space, often in subordinate roles, the empire visually rewrote the power hierarchy. Elamite nobility no longer existed as autonomous authority. It existed as Assyrian possession. That psychological inversion is critical, because power does not merely destroy, it reassigns meaning, and that reassignment is often more destabilizing than violence itself. Imagine being raised to believe you are divinely appointed, educated in ritual, trained in diplomacy, surrounded by symbols of prestige, and suddenly relocated, stripped of insignia, watched constantly, reduced to dependency. The body survives. The identity fractures. Modern trauma psychology calls this identity collapse, when external forces systematically dismantle the roles and narratives that anchor a person's sense of self. The Assyrians may not have had that terminology, but they understood the mechanics. There is evidence that some captive women were given Assyrian names. On the surface, this appears administrative, but symbolically, it signaled absorption. You are no longer who you were. You now exist under our language, under our gods, under our authority. And here is the intensity spike, the part that reveals the deeper design. Assyrian kings did not hide their cruelty. They immortalized it. Why? They were trying to eliminate the possibility of resistance. When cruelty becomes predictable, it becomes strategic. When it becomes strategic, it becomes stable. And stability built on fear can last generations. The empire endured for roughly 3 centuries, not because it was loved, but because it was feared consistently. For captured women, survival often meant living as a reminder, a walking inscription, a symbol whose very existence whispered, "Do not rebel," because humiliation can control behavior. It cannot fully extinguish memory. Archaeological discoveries across Mesopotamia have revealed private letters, household tablets, fragments of personal correspondence in Akkadian and Aramaic. Among them are traces of women's voices, often indirect, sometimes fragmented. We do not have grand memoirs. We have fragments, requests for supplies, notes about illness, mentions of children, ordinary details. And that ordinariness is powerful, because it suggests something the empire could not control: inner life. A person can be renamed publicly and still remember privately. A role can be stripped, and yet memory persists. This is where the Assyrian system reveals its flaw. It was brilliant at managing external perception. It was less effective at managing internal resilience. History tends to portray Assyria as uniquely brutal. In many ways, its records are unusually explicit. But what makes this empire haunting is not just the violence. It is the transparency. They wanted to be feared. They documented their punishments with pride. They believed fear would preserve them forever. It did not. In 612 BC, Nineveh fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians. The palaces burned, the reliefs cracked, the empire collapsed. The kings who once carved their triumphs into stone were reduced to archaeological layers. And the women who were meant to be erased, they are still here in the margins of history, not as full biographies, but as evidence, and evidence that identity resists in quiet ways. When we examine what Assyrian kings did to captured women, we are not simply studying cruelty, we are studying a blueprint. We see echoes of this pattern throughout history: strip titles, redefine narratives, publicly degrade, privately monitor, normalize the abnormal. The Assyrians perfected it early, but they were not the last. And here is the deeper reflection. The empire believed that by erasing names, it erased existence. A history does not only preserve the powerful, it preserves patterns, not glorification, recognition. The women captured in Assyrian campaigns were not footnotes. They were central to the empire's strategy of psychological warfare. Their suffering was engineered to serve policy. Their lives were transformed into warnings. Yet warnings fade. Empires fall. Stone erodes. What remains is the human capacity to endure. When you strip away the spectacle, the reliefs, the inscriptions boasting of domination, you are left with a simple truth. Power is obsessed with control. It wants to control territory. It wants to control narrative, control identity. Because if identity survives, resistance is always possible. Assyria understood this. It tried to crush identity publicly. But private memory is stubborn. And history, ironically, preserved through archaeology and scholarship, has ensured that the empire's methods are studied not with awe, but with analysis. The kings sought immortality through fear. Instead, they became case studies in the psychology of domination. The women they tried to reduce to symbols remind us of something else. That even under systems designed to erase you, the final irony. The